While I was growing up in a basement, my father did nothing to help me. I was finally saved by the mistrust that the neighbors had for me. I want to make it clear that this did not take place in the United States of America. My therapist is the only person I have shared the story with so far. However, you might find it intriguing to consider. In the past, my father was married to Alice. To tell you the truth, I had no idea how old she was. In my estimation, she was a significant amount younger than my father. The most recent thing that comes to me when I think about Alice is that she placed me down on a blanket, the house went black, and a door shut. As I lay there for a number of hours, despite my screams and tears, no one came to save me. The next earliest recollection is of Alice pulling me down a flight of stairs by my hair while I was still just staring at the ceiling. I must have been 3 years old at the time if I remember correctly. Once again, the light was turned out and once more I screamed and sobbed, but no one came to answer my calls. From the time I was 5 years old, I have the most precise context. As a result of the fact that my father worked as a fitter at the time, he was frequently absent from the house. I was alone myself with Alice, whom I had mistakenly identified as my mother. I realized very early on that Alice detested me, but I was unable to comprehend the reason for her hatred. Because she did not provide me with anything in the way of food or water, I became quite frail and skinny. In the majority of instances, while my father was off from the house, she would lock me in the basement without providing me with anything to eat or drink. My grandparents and my friends were not in my life. My mother, Alice, began homeschooling me at a young age, so I never had the opportunity to attend kindergarten. It goes without saying that I did not acquire any knowledge and that I spent my entire day in the cellar. Every once in a while, if she had a brief moment of reflection, she would bring me some water and something to eat, which was typically bread or leftovers from a previous takeaway meal. I was only permitted to leave the basement, sleep in my bed, take regular showers, and play in my room when my father was around, which was an extremely unusual occurrence. I was also denied the opportunity to play in my room. Soon after I was born, Alice instilled in me the idea that my father had a lot of work to do and that I should not bother him with my babbling. I rarely spoke in his presence because of this, and he was typically so fatigued from work that he probably didn't notice. I hardly ever spoke in his presence, not until I turned 12 years old at least. Because my father had left his profession and found a new one in the city, he was no longer required to travel outside of the city. To commemorate the occasion, he proposed that he take Alice and me out for a bite to eat. As we were leaving the house, we came across a neighbor who couldn't help but stare at us in awe. We left and had a wonderful day in the city when we drove away. I was not familiar with the town at all. It was almost as if I was looking into a completely different planet by myself. For the duration of the move, Alice maintained her gaze fixed on me, waiting for me to stop talking. At one point, my father inquired as to whether or not I had anything to share with him regarding the school, and I simply shook my head in response. As soon as we arrived at our house, Alice instructed me to get ready for bed. A doorbell was rung by the cops not even half an hour after the call was placed. When the officer informed my father that they had received a report that a youngster was being held there, my father answered the door and sounded astonished after hearing the news. I received a phone call from my father, who presented myself to the officer as his daughter. He inquired about the length of time that I had been living with him. Ever since I was born, Dad has responded. It appeared as though the police officer was skeptical, and he stated that a number of residents in the neighborhood had indicated that they had never seen me. That took Dad by surprise. I don't think he was able to comprehend the fact that despite the fact that we had been residing in this house for a number of years, no one had ever seen me. I was sitting on the sofa with my father when he turned his attention to Alice, who was standing in the doorway and sweating. After that, he turned his gaze towards me. My guess is that was the very first time he'd ever seen me, not merely a matter of casualness. The sensation of his eyes moving over me and taking in every aspect of my appearance was almost palpable to me. After that, he turned his attention back to Alice and inquired, "What have you been up to?" Alice did not make any statements, but I was aware that this was my opportunity. If I were to say something right now, my father would believe what I said. Because the police were present, there was no way that anything could happen to me. Following that, I began to speak. The first step is to speak softly and exclusively to the officer. I informed him that I was required to remain in the basement at all times. I had very little food available to me. I have no idea how to properly spell my name. That Alice is not very often seen at home. I cannot deny that my vocabulary was extremely restricted at the time. When it came to explaining what had taken place, I was completely at a loss for words. At some point, Alice began yelling at me to stop what I was doing, that I ought to just be quiet. Threats were hurled at me, and she made an attempt to approach me. However, my father leaped up and stepped in front of me. As soon as she began assaulting him, the officer promptly placed her in handcuffs. On the spot, Alice and my father were taken into custody and Child Protective Services was contacted. Following my arrival in the clinic, I was transferred to a residence where I remained for the subsequent few years. My father and Alice were brought before the judge. In contrast to Alice, who served a few years in prison, Dad was given a sentence that was suspended. During my time in the foster family, I gained knowledge that is appropriate for a child of that age. Someone told me that Alice was my stepmother and that my mother had passed away not long after I was born. This information was conveyed to me at some point in time. To this day, 30 years later, I am a person who is able to operate normally. I am married and have a child of my own. A wonderful position in a floral business. Nevertheless, there are times when I can't help but feel as though Alice has deprived me of every opportunity that life has to offer. Up to the time when he took his own life, when I was 18 years old, my father maintained a distance from me. Following the entire incident, he developed an addiction to alcohol. It was never brought to my attention what was bothering him about it, but I hope that he is content with his current situation.